I'm just going to give a brief overview of my outline of Russian influence on Indian nuclear doctrine. And I think the place to start is, the big question is, given all of the military cooperation between Russia and India for all the mainline equipment in the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, we might expect, Russian nuclear doctrine to have some influence on at least the nuclear piece of Indian military doctrine. The first thing, I want to talk about and lay out is I think it's important to nail down what is specifically Soviet or Russian about Russian nuclear doctrine. And I think it's appropriate we are talking about it now with the whole debate heating up about escalate to de-escalate strategies. And what are the unique features of Russian nuclear doctrine that countries might mimic, and particularly India? I think we need a clear sense of this, and I don't have a great sense of this yet, and kind of went through some of the different features of what we think Russian nuclear doctrine might be now, or what Soviet nuclear doctrine was during the Cold War. But there are a lot of general structural features, I've argued in the past, that drive nuclear doctrine, nuclear strategy, and they're very different between India and the Soviet Union. And so when we look at Indian nuclear doctrine, one theory might be that because of the close cooperation between the two, while India was nuclearizing essentially from the 70s on, maybe we should see some influence on the way that the Indians are thinking about nuclear doctrine. The other hypothesis is that the structural features of India and Soviet Union and Russia are so different, and that nuclear doctrine and strategy is driven by large structural or civil military relations features that maybe we shouldn't expect to see a lot of mimicking from Russia. But the high-level question I still don't have a good grasp on is, what Russian nuclear strategy actually is. So even to take current Russian nuclear doctrine, escalate to de-escalate, there are two possibilities about what that strategy is. One is it's the reality of Russian nuclear strategy, land grab in the Baltics, and if it's losing a conventional war to NATO forces, uses a nuclear weapon, limited nuclear options to offset conventional asymmetry. But if this is the case, and this is really Russian nuclear strategy, and this is where it's ended up, and whether this was always Russian nuclear strategy, then it looks a lot more like Pakistan's strategy than does India's. The other possibility is that escalate to de-escalate is just a myth, and Russia doesn't intend to use limited nuclear options, but to fight conventionally, and then if the U.S. were to use nuclear weapons, respond accordingly. If this is the case, maybe this is closer to India's strategy, but there's a lot of debate about whether the Soviet Union had a no first use policy. There are some who argue that the Soviet Union did have a no first use policy, but structurally it's hard to believe why they would, if they believe that they might be on the losing side of conventional conflict with NATO forces. But just last week, Putin said a nuclear attack on Russia or its allies would be considered a nuclear attack on our country, and we would respond accordingly. And that's not that far away from India's own nuclear doctrine on nuclear use on India or its forces anywhere would be considered an attack on India, and India would reserve the right to respond massively. So the first order of business, I think, in this study is nailing down what Russian nuclear doctrine is and what are the features of, over time, Soviet or Russian nuclear doctrine that we should be looking for to see influence on India's nuclear doctrine and strategy. So the next part of the paper will go through the pillars of Indian nuclear doctrine specifically. And I think there are three major pillars. The first is no first use. Remember, at times, the Soviet Union did apply no first use, but no one really believed it. Is this true in India today, too, where increasingly, India has a no first use policy, but it's already watered down and caveated in the official doctrine of 2003, where they talk about an exception for chemical and biological weapons. Over the time, there have been increasing high-level injections of ambiguity into India's no first use doctrine, whether there be exceptions for preemption, whether there be exceptions for certain contingencies where India, might vitiate or violate its no first use policy. I've heard people refer to India's no first use policy as a sort of no first use. And so maybe this does look like Russian or Soviet doctrine. The second pillar is massive punitive retaliation. Here I think the structural features differences between Russia and India are important. Soviet Union and Russia obviously face a different adversary than Soviet Union and Russia did. India is conventionally superior to Pakistan, and pathways to nuclear escalation with China are few and far between. And so India could, at least while Pakistan didn't have the strategy of using tactical nuclear weapons as a war-terminating strategy, a lot like escalate to de-escalate, India could have and rely on assured retaliation, or what I call massive punitive retaliation. The shift or thinking about other strategies, proportional retaliation, tit-for-tat retaliation, maybe even strategic counterforce, it's not clear where that's coming from, and even if it emerges and looks similar to things Russia has done in the past, there's no evidence that it's being imported from Russia. And the final big pillar of the Indian strategy is credible minimum deterrence. We don't know what that means anymore, because the phrase, the term minimum has been floating in and out of official doctrine in the last couple of years. And this looks very different, I think, from Soviet and Russian force posture, which, I think looks, a lot different from what India envisions in terms of, what the forces it requires for assured retaliation. But again, it faces a different adversary with limited counterforce capabilities, and so the levels of forces that India requires to assure retaliation against Pakistan and China are much lower than what the Soviet Union and Russia required against the United States. In a lot of ways, the Indian nuclear doctrine may look closest to China's in terms of the official doctrine, and the influence of Russia and Russian thinking may be much less so. And other features of the Indian posture, like the triad and the exception for chemical and biological use, calculated ambiguity, seems to be modeled on the United States. I mean, we know that the drafters of the draft nuclear doctrine in 1999 were steeped in U.S. nuclear strategy, and the idea of a triad, in addition to having bureaucratic impulses so that every service has a piece of the nuclear pie, seems to have come from the United States and thinking there, and particularly the official doctrinal caveat of threatening or leaving open the possibility of nuclear use in the event of chemical or biological use. So that's the nuclear doctrine piece. What about management of nuclear forces? Is there anything there that the Russians or Soviets may have provided a model for the Indians? I mean, India has assertive civilian control, and that isn't particularly different from what India has done. I mean, Admiral Arun Prakash at one point, when I asked him about how they're going to manage the SSBN, maybe jokingly said, they'll put political officers on the boats like the Soviets did, and it was half joking, but there is very centralized control that is becoming more and more digitized and efficient, responsive in the Indian system, but it is certainly not the U.S. Pakistani delegative system. And it does look more like the Soviet Union and China. We'll have to look for evidence that it came from the Soviet Union and not organically from India, because of the civil-military relationship, which is pathological in many ways in India. The Indian system, doesn't rely so much on political loyalty as the Soviet Union, with having KGB officers and political commissars in the chain of command to inhibit use in the Soviet and Russian system, but relied more on component separation and procedural negative controls, rather than using a political security arm, for example, to induce negative control over the system. If there's one natural place where we might expect Russian or Soviet influence, it should be in SSBN operations, because all of the Indian submarines and are of Soviet or Russian provenance, and there's been a lot of discussion of adopting the Russian model for SSBN operations, the Bastion model, instead of a continuous deterrent patrol model. And this is one place where I think you might be able to tease out evidence of direct Soviet or Russian influence. It worked for the Soviet Union because they wanted to maximize political control and didn't want to have their submarines exposed to American anti-submarine warfare. And there are a lot of reasons why India may want to adopt a bastion model as well. Certainly doesn't have enough submarines to have one on continuous deterrent patrol, but it also maximizes centralized control, command and control over the submarines, and they wouldn't have to have armed nuclear weapons at sea at all times. The advantage with the Soviet Union was that they had sanctuaries in the northern ports, and India, has the thermal layer in the Indian Ocean that the Indian Navy likes to take advantage of, but it's very different than the Soviet model where they had a lot of sanctuary in ports up in the north, but they were vulnerable as they flushed out into the Atlantic Ocean in particular. But the Indians have a limited number of ports. They're warm water ports. They could be very vulnerable as they're coming out to ASW. But the thinking on the bastion model, I think, is probably the best bet for evidence of direct Soviet modeling on operations. For the Air Force and the land-based forces, I find little evidence of Soviet or Russian doctrinal influence. Doesn't mean it's absent. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But the air vector relies on French equipment mostly. Mirages and Jaguars, maybe the Rafales, and gravity bombs. This is very different, I think, from the Soviet heavy bomber force. The ballistic missile force for the land-based missiles is largely indigenous. Very little cooperation with the Soviet Union. The one capability that does have direct Russian cooperation is the BrahMos, and that is potentially, a hell of a missile that could be used for a variety of standoff missions, both conventional and nuclear, maybe counterforce. So the BrahMos could be likely, a candidate for exploring how Russia is developing cruise and hypersonic missiles to defeat U.S. missile defenses. The Indians might be importing some of that thinking also. So the BrahMos actually might be something worth exploring in greater detail, although it's not officially a nuclear assigned missile yet. So my tentative conclusions are, given the level of cooperation over the years in a variety of military platforms, other than maybe the SSBN model and how India chooses to manage the sea leg of its nuclear force, there seems to be a little doctrinal influence on Indian nuclear strategy, although I do leave open the possibility that the BrahMos and that particular joint venture with the Russians could be a big part of an Indian shift towards a more counterforce-oriented nuclear strategy if it decides to go there, which it would be rational for Indian strategic thinkers to think about trying to disarm if you had to, a small Pakistani strategic force that you've been watching for a long time. And so accuracy and speed and standoff capabilities like the BrahMos provides could be an attractive option for that. And maybe there's some Russian influence in thinking there. So then the question is, well, if there's limited influence, why, given how direct the military cooperation has been? I think, for me, as a kind of a realist at heart, the structural conditions between India and the Soviet Union and Russia are just so different. They face different adversaries. They have different conventional balances against their primary adversaries or geographical buffers against China. And India's resource allocation and architecture is just much smaller and less sophisticated across the board, so it can do less than the Russian nuclear strategy and force structure can. And so we shouldn't be surprised that India's going to look, Indian nuclear strategy is going to look different than Russia or the Soviet Union. But it is interesting that, maybe certain pieces of it have influence from Russia and the Soviet Union. We need to nail down what's uniquely Soviet or Russian about that, and before we can say that, that's a likely hypothesis for SSBN operations and or approaches to defeating missile defenses or having regional counterforce. If there is one, historically, the flip side is when when India has looked for a model for nuclear strategy and force posture, I think a lot more comes from the West, and the United States in particular, and China. I think there's a lot of similarities to China in a lot of ways, but there's still some pieces to be worked out. I don't think that there's a significant amount of cooperation or influence from the Russian nuclear strategy or doctrine, but there are pieces, and it's worth exploring.